I think some of you are old enough to remember Dr. Spock, not the Vulcan, but the pediatrician, and his incredibly famous bestseller, Baby and Child Care. This book was written in 1946, and it became one of the best-selling volumes in all of published history. If you're a baby boomer, you were probably raised on its principles. Every household seemed to have a copy. Now, 200 years earlier, in 1747, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, wrote a massive healthcare bestseller called Primitive Physic, an easy and natural method of curing most diseases. You can still purchase that on Amazon, Dr. Steele. You have a copy. I mean, every house on the prairie, so to speak, had at least two books, the Bible and Primitive Physic. And Wesley became very famous in his day. He was a money-making machine through the means of this book and other aspects of his entrepreneurial spirit. And yet Wesley said of himself, "When I die, if I leave behind me 10 pounds, we're talking England, if I leave behind me 10 pounds, you and all humanity may bear witness against me that I have lived and died a thief and a robber." When Wesley died in 1791, the only money mentioned in his will was the miscellaneous coins to be found in his pockets and dresser drawers. Wesley thought about, wrote about, and practiced what I would call the sacrament of money. He embodied, in reference to Jesus' wisdom teaching, not the foolish farmer of the parable, but the wise farmer who loves God and yearns to see God's kingdom come. Wesley taught and embodied 3 rules of money. Gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And that's how Wesley lived. And he certainly earned a ton of money. I think some say he might have been one of the richest people in England at the time. And if Wesley had been a normal guy, he would have invested those funds. He would have watched his barns get bigger. He would have secured a solid retirement and still given away a bunch of surplus to others. But he wasn't normal. He was a workaholic. He was so full of passionate zeal for God. His entire life was focused on that, which also meant that his marriage was a wreck. He was never home. But he used his money, gain all you can, and to sustain and to keep alive the Methodist movement. Money came in abundantly and money went out abundantly. He was a man of tremendous zeal and commitment. In other words, someone we can easily discount. What about us normal folk? What about those of us who have mutual callings in life? That we have callings for intimate relationships, for marriage, for fathering or mothering? What about those of us who desire a healthy home as the evidence of God with us? Is it useful, is it wise to follow Wesley's example of zealotry? Oh, about 200 years later, Ray Fisher grew up in a Methodist household. But as a young man, the church didn't speak to him, and he just walked away. Not in anger, not in rebellion, just walked away. And he became a successful patents lawyer. And like the farmer, he brought in an abundant harvest. And he retired well. And it was then in his retirement that Ray had a series of events that reawakened his faith, his trust, his awareness, his experience of God. Like Wesley 200 years previously, Ray had a strange warming of his heart. For me, God's love is for me. And it enraptured him. Ray reconnected to his roots, and he set about returning to his faith. And out of that spiritual experience came a conviction for Ray. He felt that he had robbed God of his tithe, of his life, of his capacity to do some good in the world. He had missed opportunities in his life. And so now Ray decided that he believed in this tithe. A tithe, if you will, is another word for a tenth. He believed that a tithe was giving 10% of his wealth to the work of God in the world. And so Ray, and if you knew him, won't surprise you, meticulously researched and reviewed his life, examining every penny he had ever made, and he decided he would use his remaining years to give back 10% of all that he had ever made in his life. And he did it. It took him a while, but he did it. He achieved his goal. And then he kept giving. Having learned to live on a certain amount, he just kept living on that amount. And in his death, several churches and other individuals were given inheritances, gifts of grace that changed lives, that left an example to follow. While alive, Ray Fisher became a mentor for me. His gift of hospitality, taking a very young pastor under his wing, inviting me over to lunch. Ray had the ability to make the best microwave food I've ever eaten. I don't know what he did, but whatever came out of his microwave was so delicious. And he filled afternoons. I was over there 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. And he loved to talk about Methodist history and theology and genealogy. And he was just an absolute gift to me. He lived just a normal life. He was just a normal guy. And he added to that extraordinary generosity and hospitality and the lived security of someone who lived in gratitude. It was all around him. I don't believe I can live like Wesley. I never have. Unless something changes, I doubt that I ever will. But I would like to live like Ray Fisher. Now, Ray believed in this 10% tithe. The tithe is a human custom. It's rooted in the biblical story of Abraham, who presents a tenth of his war spoils to this mysterious biblical man named Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Now, Michael in the back his ears will prick up because I have always threatened to name my children Melchizedek because I just love the name. Now, further, and again, this is from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Jews would bring 10% of their harvest to a storehouse as a welfare plan for the needy, or in case of a community-wide famine. That's where the notion of a tithe comes from. And if you want to look at it literally, Abraham, the immigrant, gave tribute to an agent that would give him protection and status. And the collective 10% of the harvest was a good old-fashioned redistribute the wealth for the common good of all tax that kept the peace and prevented homelessness and built a common good. What Ray Fisher and other examples taught me was to understand money as a spiritual power. Positively, money, I think, is a sacrament. And when I say sacrament, I mean, think of the Eucharist, think of baptism, a physical element, juice, bread, water, that points beyond itself towards a meaning of far greater depth and width. I think of my wedding ring. My wedding ring for me is a sacrament. When I see it, when I fidget with it, which is quite a lot if you watch me, when I feel it, I can think of Kathy and of Mike and of Andy. Even if the physical bodies of Kathy and Mike and Andy are not present, I can experience the deeper truth that they're always with me because I am not myself without them. I belong to them. Money has a power beyond its appearances. Like my ring, money is a physical element. It's a means and measure of value. And yet it is much more than that. If you want to know what you really value in life, just review your financial transactions. What is it that you spend your money on? That's what you value. That's where your priorities are. I remember a few years back when the kids were little and Kath was barely working half-time. And my compensation was really lean. And we were having a great difficulty just making it in life. And as so many who struggle, that's when we fell into the money trap. We began to spend more than we made. We had these magical cards that would give us money. And we fell into a trance. And we thought that the money it was giving us was real. And soon we found ourselves $25,000 in debt. And without capacity to really start paying that down, which meant the interest rates kept going up. I even scouted around for part-time jobs just so that we could continue making those interest payments. And that's when, and it was led by Kathy and this radio guy named Dave Ramsey, that we had our conversion to debt-free living. That's when Kathy and I woke up to the negative power that money was having over our lives. And so we went on a really tight money diet. We made a bunch of sacrifices. We had this shoebox, and in it we put envelopes. And in envelopes, we literally took out money and put certain amounts of money in these envelopes, which meant when the envelope was empty, no more money could come out of that for anything, for any reason. So we needed a way to lose money weight. And it took us 18 months as we paid down the debt. And we haven't looked back since. It was a tough 18 months for us. And in my reflections on how we became so indebted, and when you're in debt, you are enslaved. It's no different in biblical times. It's no different for us. Debt is a form of slavery. I realized in all of that I had given money a sacred power. I had given money so much significance that I was allowing it to shape what I valued. And I was allowing it to control my life. A used car that I could afford becomes a really nice van that I can't afford. But we have kids, so we can justify it. Watching friends take vacations that I couldn't afford caused me to resent, and then created in my own interior life a sense of shame and guilt. And I found that my own self-esteem was being fashioned around being a consumer or a provider of consumption. And as a pastor, I was preaching the freedom of the gospel, but in my own life, I was enslaving myself to Pharaoh. Getting out of debt became an exorcism for us. And it led me to grasp the spiritual power that money holds on our imagination and on our will. In my past, God had freed me from addictions to drugs and despair. Could God free this pastor from an addiction to wanting stuff and the status that stuff gives to those who own it? For me, it was mostly about status. The example of Ray Fisher and other mentors like Jacques Ellul and Ron Sider, throwing that in for you, Rick. They gave me some tools, particularly the spiritual tool, the technique of the tithe, as a way to leave Egypt and move into the new creation. Like Frodo's ring, money had become a compelling allure, something I deeply desired. And although it is it's necessary to have money in life, not arguing that, but it need not become what dominates your life and imagination, your securities. I have found the tithe to be a really useful spiritual tool to experience both gratitude and freedom in my own life. So, how do I actually deal with my own money? Not perfectly. I'm middle class. I'm compromised. I am not pure. I buy things I don't need. I overspend on vacation. Tomorrow night I will go to a Mariners game. Have you ever bought a hot dog at a Mariner game? I will spend money frivolously, but I won't buy a beer. Those are too expensive. $9. Never mind. And from time to time, I'll sneak into McDonald's. See what I mean? I'm not a purist. I wrestle with the allure of money because I like money. I like what it buys. I appreciate money. I appreciate what it buys. I know just enough, not a lot. I know just enough of what living without money can do to make me appreciate what it can do. So how do I actually deal with my money? And this might not be a very good example for many of you. Our finances are very simple. Kathy and I don't own property. We don't own stocks. We don't have investments. I get a paycheck, and we we have a 401 for our retirement. But I'm a 10%er. I strive to live on 90% of my income, whatever it is, and to structure my life around that 90%, as if that's all the money we have. I stay away from credit. We're not indebted. I use 10% of the funds that remain in ways that limit its power, that demystify it, that desacralize it. I consciously strive to limit the power of money over what I value and what I set as priorities. In other words, I just give away 10% of my assets as a way to practice freedom from the spiritual enslavement of money that causes me to place my security and my status in its acquisition. And when I say 10%, I'm talking about real money, not theoretical money. Paycheck comes in, if it's $5,000, $500 gets put to what we define as the work of God in the world. If I owned property and sold it, 10% would do the same. If I owned stock, 10% would do the same. If I came into kind of a windfall, 10% would do the same. But that's just, and this is important, that's just my definition of a tithe. Each must come to their own peace of mind. There are, in my discernment, no set rules about what constitutes a tithe. The whole of our life is a tithe to God. Giving away 10% has helped me to experience a bit of freedom from the allure of money. It's helped me desacralize the power of money over my values and priorities. My tithe is how I exorcise my demons. Now, someday when Kathy and I retire, will receive monthly income from Social Security and from our 403 and so forth, and let's say it's $6,000 a month. Well, that means $600 a month will go out to the work of God. And when we die, at least 10% of our estate will, don't listen to this, Mike, 10% of our estate will be tithed to churches, ministries, and missionaries. And like many of you, as Kathy and I age, we'll begin to adjust those final bequests, hopefully giving way beyond 10% to agencies that we value. After all, we're dead. We don't need the money anymore. And if our families are flourishing, there's a value. Why not give more of one's assets to the greater stability of community? Thank God, literally, for those who fund the arts, who donate land for community parks, who set up foundations and public trusts, who endow charitable organizations and think tanks and so on. But again, all of this is a matter of conscience, not of rule, not of obedience to God. Never let a preacher tell you that God demands such and such of your money. For example, despite all of the talk about a 10% tithe, sociologists tell us the truth, that basically folks give away 2 to 3% of their income. Surveys indicate that 247 million Americans identify as Christians. Only maybe 1.5 million subscribe to what's called a tithe. I think we just need to be honest about money. And I actually think that one of the reasons we're so dishonest, and even more so why we don't talk about it, or why it's so hidden from each other, why we're even afraid to talk one-on-one with each other about what we make, I think it just goes to show how much we possesses us. That's my take. The spiritual discipline of a tithe, whether it be 1%, 10%, 30%, that's a matter of conscience. And from a Christian point of view, the important teaching is that the whole of your life is your offering. That's what reflects the glory of God on earth as in heaven, with no strings attached. Now, this personal example must be understood as coming from a person of privilege. I have successfully navigated the capitalist system we live under. I have a roof over my head, I have food in my belly, I have surplus in the bank. Some folks have not been so lucky. And so my own rule of thumb is this: if you don't have financial surplus in your life, then make your tithe your set-aside sacred commitment to God. Make that something else. A tithe of your time, a tithe of volunteering, of serious, focused, concentrated prayer, a time of visitation, a time of ministry, of neighborly care. In other words, if you don't have financial surplus, then give from whatever surplus you have. God does not need you to suffer so that the church survives and thrives. God does not need you to suffer so that the church survives and thrives. God is not Pharaoh forcing us to make bricks without straw. God has set us free to live a life of love, of abundant joy, of peace. And so when it comes to sacrificial giving, I basically think that's for those of us who have the means to sacrifice. What spiritual maturity teaches us is that our whole life is a gift that's given to us, and having received this gift, we learn to pass it on, to pay it forward. We experience giving as an expression of gratitude and humility. We become like Snoopy, with snout in the air and feet pitter-pattering on the ground, because we're just so thankful. So upon this rock, our capital funds drive is going to be a heavy lift, and it's really about sacrificial giving. And so for those of us who have financial surplus, it will require a sacrifice of giving beyond our tithe. Perhaps shifting some priorities, certainly praying for discernment. But I also hope that such a challenge can become a joyful expression, something you want to do, not something you feel forced to do. I hope our hearts will be full of hope and that our confidence will be such that we will know that God will use our efforts for purposes that will astonish us. The drive is focused on our future, a post-COVID world that is full of possibilities and opportunities. Who knows how all of this will change and transform us? So I want to close by just continuing the reading that Jenny started. This is what Jesus says immediately after the parable of the farmer. Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? If then you are not able to do such a small thing as that, don't worry. Why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even King Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will God clothe you, you of little faith? And do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and don't keep worrying, for it is the Gentiles, it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things. And your Abba knows that you need them. Indeed, strive for God's kingdom, and all those things that you've been so worried about, all your securities will be given to you as well. Something to think about. Amen.